Hi, everybody. This is Frank McNally from Public Spend Forum. Welcome to our webinar for today on the Small Business Innovation Research Program. We're going to get started in just a second. Just going to give a few minutes for everybody to sign on and get settled. So hold tight, and we'll be right with you. Great, we got some folks rolling in here, so thank y'all for joining us. This is Frank McNally from Public Spend Forum, and we are going to get started in just a moment. Well, all right, we can go ahead and get started now, and as folks join on, they can just pick up right where we are. So this is Frank McNally at Public Spend Forum. We've got a great webinar today on the Small Business Innovation Research Program, which I think is affectionately called America's Seed Fund for Startups, which I think is pretty cool. Our webinar today is sponsored by Evalua, our very special sponsor. And Evalua is a complete unified source-to-pay suite. So they're basically an e-procurement system with a lot of great clients in the private sector and public sector, including the city of New York. They've done some amazing work digitizing New York City's procurement system and helping them go paperless, which is awesome from a lot of different perspectives. Definitely invite you to check out Evalua, the procurement empowerment platform at evalua.com. And thanks to Evalua for sponsoring our webinar today. A little bit about Public Spend Forum before we get started. We are a market intelligence platform for public sector buyers and suppliers. We provide supplier and market data for contracting professionals and companies alike. We offer best practice frameworks and standards and tools on how to buy and how to improve what you do in the market today. We also feature a global community and network of peers and experts in public procurement through our online, I guess call it repository at publicspendforum.net. Registration is free. Definitely invite you to check out those awesome resources at publicspendforum.net. One of the things that we do is offer GovShop, which is a single place to search, find, and connect with suppliers. We're really excited about this tool. It's kind of, I think about it like a Google for government market research. It's easy to use and free. So, you know, there's nothing to download, no software to buy. It is browser-based. You can start searching on it today. We built it with the needs of the government marketplace in mind. So you'll see there's filters that's specific to government procurement. When you do use it for market research, there's I think 800,000 supplier profiles in there now, all of whom are registered and interested in doing business with the government. So you can search for your ideal suppliers and learn about the market in GovShop 3 different ways: by keyword, category code, or by contract type. So if you want to save time and effort by going on a vehicle, GovShop's a great place to do that. Okay, on to today's topic. I'm going to introduce our special guest here in just a second, but we did want to talk today about the Small Business Innovation Research Program. Want to cover what it is and why you should care, give you a little overview of the process and what you might expect if you decide to pursue SBIR funding. We'll talk about what makes an ideal candidate for an SBIR grant and discuss a little bit about finding opportunities for getting involved in the SBIR program. And this deck, which we will send out to everyone after the webinar concludes, will include some critical resources that you absolutely should start to read if you're serious about taking advantage of SBIR. We did design this for an audience of entrepreneurs, startups, and small businesses, especially emerging technology providers that are looking for seed funding to develop their products and do that research that's required to take them to market. But if you're a government contracting professional, it's probably going to be an interesting topic as well, because we've got a practitioner who has actually won several SBIR grants himself and helped others earn them as well through their company, Eastern Foundry. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Orizum from Eastern Foundry. Jeff, would you like to say a couple words about yourself?
Yeah, Phil, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate the chance to come on and talk about a program I really love. Yeah, and as you pointed out, we've been on kind of every side of the SBIR program. We've applied unsuccessfully, we've applied successfully a couple times. We've built educational resources and put redacted proposals up online to help other people. We've run workshops on SBIR. And actually, we're now on contract to build tools for the SBIR program to make it easier for future applicants. So yeah, I've seen the program go a lot of different directions.
Well, great. So it's going to be awesome to learn from your successes and your failures and your involvement in SBIR. So I do want to invite everyone out there, by the way, if you have questions, would love to make this an interactive webinar. You can use the chat feature to ask questions, or you can use the Q&A. You'll find both of those in the tool panel at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So Jeff and I would love to take your questions, throughout the webinar as well as at the end. So take advantage of the knowledge that you have today in Jeff. So Jeff, tell us a little bit about Eastern Foundry before we jump in.
Yeah, so Eastern Foundry is a co-working community with locations in Crystal City, Roslyn, and now Fayetteville, North Carolina, that really tries to convene a ecosystem of government contracting business owners, professional services providers, government agencies who are looking for small and innovative solutions to problems they have. And we bring them all together under, well, at this point, 3 different roofs, but under a common community with common events and educational resources. Try to equip them with the professional support, with the mentorship, with the access to customers. Gosh, everything we can think of that a small or even a mid-sized government contracting company needs to be successful. And we've been doing that. We're coming up on our 5-year anniversary of that. So pretty excited about that benchmark. And then we're now migrating, thank you. And now we're migrating more and more into software and media. So yeah, it's been an exciting run for us.
That's terrific. I've had the opportunity to visit your 2 spaces in Northern Virginia. Really impressive setup you have out there. And I'm from North Carolina, as is my colleague Anissa. So hopefully one day I might be able to go down to Fayetteville and check that out too.
Yeah,
so for sure. Great. All right. So, okay, Jeff, this is the SBIR program sort of mission statement and goals that I pulled down from the SBIR website. But why don't you tell us sort of in your own words what it is and why we should care about it?
Yeah. So I think there are probably 2 broad reasons you should care about SBIR. Number one is if you think that government is kind of part of your long-term business model, one of your long-term customers, SBIR is a great on-ramp for you. And, I think that with traditional contracting, there's a lot of competition out there. There's, a premium put on process knowledge and having the right boxes checked before you can win something. On SBIR, I think they reduce those expectations a little bit because they know that this is a program specifically designed for small businesses, and even more targeted than that, it's for non-traditional small businesses. So I think the weight that gets put on the quality of your idea goes up, and maybe the priority that's placed on process knowledge and administrative compliance knowledge goes down a little bit. So that's one avenue for those of you who are squarely government oriented, and then for those of you who are not, who don't necessarily see the federal government as being on your long-term roadmap or maybe on your short-term roadmap, SBIR is a great way to get some seed capital together to be able to fund your development. So kind of as you said in the very beginning, the program tags itself as America's Seed Fund. And that's largely correct. It is a pot of about $3 billion a year that the different federal agencies with significant R&D programs will convene and then distribute to small research programs. So if you have a product that you want to develop, expand, build new features for, whatever it is, you can get, a couple thousand, we're talking up to $1 million in a lot of cases. And sometimes more, depending on how well you leverage the system, to be able to build out a product and then also get an early customer in the form of the agency that put out that need. So whether you're looking at this as an on-ramp for long-term government contracting or as an on-ramp for just short-term accelerating growth capital, both are great applications of the SBIR program.
Just for folks in our audience maybe who aren't or don't have as much exposure in the VC world or startup world. Seed funding, can you kind of describe that concept just a bit so people can understand what seed funding is and why it's so valuable for a startup?
Yeah, so if we think about the investment life cycle of a company as a series of, I think it may be easiest to think about it as a series of risk mitigation steps. So, if you imagine that one day you're going to be Apple, well, what are the risks that sit between you as you exist today and you as you exist in a couple of years, the size and dominance of Apple? Well, there's a whole series of technical risks, in the sense of you want to build a product. Are you able to break the technological barriers that right now are preventing that product from already existing? Then there are a group of market barrier or market risks. So what are the things around having how do I say this, a good response and a desire from your customers to pay for your product? That there's a risk that won't happen. And then, there's the risk associated with your team. Is the team that you've assembled going to be able to grow the company in this way? And a lot of it, I think the way that I've heard these different rounds of investment characterized is that they're all about addressing one of those risks, or frankly, probably just a sub part of one of those risks. So the way I usually hear seed funding talked about is that it's an initial kind of one part technical risk and one part market risk. So the seed round is there to give you enough money to be able to develop kind of the smallest prototype version of your product, and then get some initial customer feedback to be able to validate that, yes, okay, I've de-risked that most basic element of your technology, and I've de-risked that first most basic element of your market engagement. And you can do that.
Why would that be the government's responsibility? I mean, like, to me, it seems like a startup, if they're going to go out and try to do this, they're going to raise the money, they're going to reap the rewards. Why would the government want to be responsible for providing that seed capital?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple different ways to approach that answer. So one thing to think about is that when government is engaged in procurement, they're not just trying to procure the best item at the best price. I mean, the whole underlying premise of having minority and women and veteran set-asides is that they want to leverage the massive buying power of the federal government to promote other social outcomes. In this case, promotion of entrepreneurship and economic success among traditionally disadvantaged groups. And I think this is another manifestation of that instinct that the government has, that federal spending should do more than just buy goods and services for the federal government. So the vast majority, 97% of all federal R&D dollars are going to fund long-term research, cures to cancer and putting people on the moon, things like that, those big ticket items, or next generation stealth technology, whatever it is. But the only groups that are going to be able to absorb those giant checks from the federal government are federally funded research organizations or universities, and basically that's what it breaks down to. And as you can imagine, those are going to be located in just a few areas. Frankly, a lot in the DC metro area. So one of the objectives is to spread the dollar to have more of this social benefit coming back to the federal government, or sorry, going to the nation via this giant pot of R&D funding. So there's this entire idea of the social benefit that is being distributed through SBIR by diversifying the recipient list of federal R&D cash. And then there's a second reason, which is, if the federal government gives all their money to these big institutions, well, you're going to get big institutional solutions. But the government also wants to be able to get the benefit of some really small, exotic, far out solutions that maybe the big players wouldn't necessarily come up with, because they're coming to the problem with a different mindset and a different set of incentives.
Interesting. So literally seeding ideas, basically finding small startups, new thinkers with creative ideas, and giving them a bit of money to research their idea and de-risk what could otherwise be a challenging investment climate, I suppose.
Yeah, there's sort of a traditional wisdom that investors don't want to touch technology risk. You know, they're right or wrong. I think there's this sort of the conventional wisdom is that by the time you make it to a VC, you better have your technology baked. And what you're really trying to get the VC to do is to give you the cash to de-risk all of the market risks, you know, the product customer fit elements. You know, the government takes a very different approach. They don't necessarily care. They're very, very comfortable with technology risk. You know, these are the organizations that are funding basic research that won't pay off for 20 years. But when it does, you get the internet.
Right. I guess it's also this. There's a social mission too. Like venture capitalists and investors in general are. I mean, they're capitalists. If there's not a return in the next couple of years, they're unlikely to put their money into play there. So something like the SBIR can provide, you know, money to entrepreneurs that are working on problems that may have more social impact than they do economic benefit for the investors. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think that, you know, if you think about, you know, I read a lot of SBIR topics, and, you know, vaccines frequently come out of HHS. You know, it's a relatively small or a low population disease. You know, it probably wouldn't be worth it for a GlaxoSmithKline or any of the other big pharma companies to go do that research. And, you know, the universities want to be working on the big diseases, the big social issues that are facing the country. But at the same time, there's a real community of people that are being hurt by this disease. And if there was a vaccine available, well, that would be great. And so it's, you know, it's something that's more manageable. It's smaller. It still meets a real need, but it's something that the market may not have the same incentives to address.
And it's, you know, it's other things. It's a great little case study that I pulled when I was reading it. You know, vaccines curing cancer on one end of the spectrum, and then this little company, Bolt Threads, on the other end of the spectrum, which basically took funding from SBIR to find a more sustainable type of thread made out of, I guess, spider web, effectively, to create clothes. And so that's something where, you know, somebody might look at that and go, well, big deal. What's the, you know, why would I want to invest in that? You know, well, if we can use a renewable resource, something that has less economic, you know, impact, and that's going to take a ton of research and development to create. So, you know, you might be out there thinking, well, my idea is sort of small compared to curing cancer, but now I would say look at somebody like Bolt Threads and take inspiration there. There's a lot of companies like that, which I think we have some case studies we'll talk about as we go through. But should we jump over to talk about the phases of the program?
Sure.
Or do you think anything else you want to say on this?
No, let's jump over to the phases. Excellent.
Well, it's pretty simple in a diagram, but I'm sure it's a bit more complicated than that. Phase one, feasibility and proof of concept. What happens in this phase, Jeff? What do we need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I would say is that, you know, I'm happy to address this slide directly, although I think there is a lot of stuff that's kind of happening in the phase zero. But, you know, maybe for people for people who are calling in that are not so familiar with the program, you know, I don't know if people on the phone can indicate if this is just stuff they already know, and, you know, we can, you know, kind of bypass some of the basics. So if there's any way to pull that, if people want to volunteer, how much knowledge they already have, and I can kind of calibrate my comments accordingly. But while that's happening, I'll just address this slide because, you know, this is something you're going to hear all the time. Three-phase program. Although to be honest, I would consider it more of a 2.5-phase program. But phase one, and it varies by agency, and different agencies have different SBIR variants and flavors even within them. But as a rule of thumb, what you're trying to do there is to do that first pass technological de-risking to be able to convince the government that it's been sufficiently de-risked that you deserve to get a much larger check. So, you know, as you see, it's about 100, you know, and again, it varies between agencies, but 150,000 is good kind of center mass for what that pool of dollar figures looks like. And, you know, the idea is being that with 150,000, you should be able to do the bench research, you know, maybe even some light lab research, you know, write the beginnings of the code to demonstrate. And frankly, a lot of the time what you see here is that it's people with PhDs in a particular area or, deep subject matter expertise coming out of an agency. So in a lot of ways, they've kind of got 80% of the phase one already wrapped up. And they just need a little bit of cash to validate the that they've already built out. But really that's what it's about is, if we give you a drip, can you sufficiently convince us that it's a low risk and thus deserving of more money to go to flesh out whatever idea it is that you might have?
Can you turn spiderweb into clothes? Basically.
Exactly.
Will this actually work?
Yeah, do it exactly. It's like do it in a lab, make 1 foot of spider thread, and convince us that it can be done technologically. And then now in phase 2, we're going to go give you, up to 1 million. Again, good. It varies by agency, but 1 million is a good planning figure. It's sort of basically, can you then take that 1 foot of thread and improve your process and improve the technology to be able to start churning out thread at a pace that you could actually make clothing. So it's largely about bringing some scale and reproducibility to the platform, to your product. And this is when in phase 2 is when you hopefully start seeing some commercial success. So you've got 50 feet of this spider thread, and you find a customer who will raise their hand and say, "Gosh, this is really exciting. I want it." And other things that are indicators of there being some commercial traction, so that the federal government is not the only future customer.
So you're kind of getting your minimum viable product into market to prove that it's viable. It's something that you produce and could be used before you move into what I imagine would be the creation of a full manufacturing facility of giant spiders spinning clothes. That would be phase 3.
Exactly.
Interesting. Now, phase 0, though, tell us a little bit. I mean, should we go to the next slide and talk about sort of phase 0 as we think about ideal candidates, or stay here? What would be?
Yeah, tell you what, just to close out this slide. So phase 3, then, with the expectation is that you've prepared yourself and that you are capable of scaling, and that all that the government has to do is to basically add water and you will grow beautifully. And so phase 3, it's not a funded grants-like phase. Basically, phase 3 is I don't really think it should be called a phase. Phase 3 is really more of a privileged contracting vehicle that allows the winner of the phase 1 and 2 to be able to work much more easily with the federal government. So if there's a federal buyer out there who says, "Gosh, I need spider thread today, and I'm ready to give you $1 million," instead of going through all the hassle of traditional contracting, you would be able to take that $1 million in relatively short order in a much simplified fashion. So
Got it. Okay. We do have our first question from Christoph. He asks, when do you usually start to apply for phase 2? Would it be during phase 1 or after phase 1? And I think the qualifiers, if it was after phase 1, then would that lead to a funding gap in between the 2 phases?
Yeah, great question. This is one of the perennial frustrations with SBIR. So there is a way to go direct to phase 2. Basically, if you can show the agency that you've done all the proof of concept type work that you would ordinarily do in phase 1, you can basically petition to send you directly to phase 2 with that larger dollar size. But putting that aside, that's a relatively small group of individuals who do that, or small group of companies that do that. So to answer Christoph's question, generally speaking, the 6 months is going to culminate with the application for phase 2. So, just as a matter of pragmatism, you probably need to start scoping, doing the broad, blocking and tackling around your phase 2 proposal, 2 months before your phase 1 ends. So the hope is that you've got enough data and enough promising content that you can start at least, doing the framework of your proposal, getting letters of support, all the other things that go into a phase 2 proposal, which, by the way, tend to be pretty robust documents. This is a non-trivial lift in the actual application. So typically you're going to apply right around the end of your phase 1. Unfortunately, there does tend to be a long lag time between phase 1 and phase 2. You can easily, I'd say minimum with all but the new Air Force program. The Air Force has recently released a new dual-use technology, SBIR, and wow, they have dramatically accelerated the timelines for the program. But for everybody else, I think a good planning figure would be 8 months of gap between your phase 1 and getting your first check on phase 2, assuming you win. So for like 99% of people, that means there's going to be a funding gap. For 100% of people, there's going to be a funding gap unless you have obviously outside funding. And so a lot of people at that point are looking at, either covering that gap through personal savings, an investment from a VC, because at that point, this is actually one of the nice things about SBIR, is that you've just got $150,000 from the government. You've hopefully been able to de-risk a lot of the technical risk through that development of a proof of concept. So when you're going to a VC, the risk profile is much lower, hopefully. So that means you hopefully get a much better valuation. But or you end up laying off your whole team, waiting 8 months until the phase 2 gets awarded, and then you hope that some of them are available to rehire.
We have a couple follow-ups around this, but I do want to stay on this point. I mean, so if I'm a startup and I get phase 1 funding, I get that $150K for proof of concept, I immediately go out and raise on that, right? And I want to go raise more money from VCs saying, look, I'm part of the SBIR grant. I want to raise more money. Do they typically do that? Are there rules against that? How does that work?
It used to be that it was really strict about how whether or not a venture-backed company could take SBIR funding. Those rules have relaxed a lot, and in fact, some of the SBIR programs are now giving you either advantages in your evaluation for SBIR, or sometimes they'll even match venture investors' money. And the idea is that, hey, if this idea is good enough for a VC to put their money into, it's probably been significantly de-risked. Therefore, it's safer for the government to put more money in.
Interesting.
So, but I think that probably the way that I would think about that conversation would be: you win an SBIR, and then you build hopefully you've got your pitch deck already, and you would go to the VCs. But I think it would be a different framing. You wouldn't, because I don't think that you'd be looking for funding immediately, because at the very beginning of your SBIR, you still have all that technical risk. You haven't had the time to do the work to de-risk your concept. At the same time, I think it would behoove everybody out there to win their SBIR, say, okay, this is at least some minimal validation that some group of government-associated scientists and technical practitioners thought that this was a pretty solid idea. I'm going to go reach out to the VC community and say, hey, by the way, this just happened. I wanted to orient you to it, and because I'd really like to come back to you at like month 4, month 3, month 4, somewhere around there, when hopefully some of the early evidence from your research and development has begun to come to fruition. You can have some data points to point to of success, and then you can go to them and say, hey, by the way, we're not finished with our SBIR, but we've had some promising results so far, and we'd like to position you so that when our money runs out in month 8, assuming you have assuming you don't spend all of it in the first 6 months, or even if you do, say, hey, look, I want to be able to come back to you at the end of the SBIR to be able to look for that follow-on investment round. The only thing I would say is just be aware that the more you need the money, the worse your valuation is going to be.
All right. So, okay. So Christoph's had a follow-up here that I think is relevant before we get to Peter's question. Is there a deadline for the phase 2 application? Do I have to get that in? Yeah.
So good question. So the whole program is based on phases. So there'll be an intake, depending on the agency, maybe once a year, maybe twice, 3 times a year. So as a rule of thumb, there's going to be a phase 2 intake right around the end of the phase 1 period of performance. that being said, you might come back and say, gosh, you know what, my phase 1 research didn't work as well as I had hoped. I need to go do some more stuff. You skip a cycle, let everyone know. It's like, hey, look, I need more time, basically. And then you go do your own independent research, and you can come back 6 months later and pick up that next phase 2 application cycle.
Okay. And is it possible to apply for phase 1 and phase 2 like at the same time for the same basic idea, or can you only apply to one or the other?
Yeah. So here there are only a few things in the government world that will get you into a lot of trouble. And one of the things that will get you into a lot of trouble is if the government pays you twice for the same work, including the same R&D. So the short answer is you could take the exact same idea and you could apply to every agency, all 13 SBIR programs at the same time, or whenever their due dates are. But you have to make sure that you're alerting all of the agencies about any other agencies you're submitting the same idea to about the others, because they want to know that, hey, Peter has applied to 2 different agencies for the same basic concept. And you're exposing yourself to some risk there. There's a chance that they'll say, oh, they applied to HHS and Defense Health for the same basic concept. Okay, you know what? I'm sure HHS will fund it, and HHS says, I'm sure Defense Health will fund it, and you don't get funded. So you can. So the short answer is you can apply to phase 1 and to phase 2, but you're going to need to let the people know. And this is a place where I would talk to the program manager. So every SBIR has a responsible officer, a program officer for it. These are the places where I would give that person a call and just say, hey, I don't know if I'm kind of between phase 1 and phase 2. What do you recommend? How should I be thinking about this? And especially as long as this RFP is not on the street, like if the next intake of solicitations for the SBIR program that you're interested in don't start until whatever December, well, the RFP, there's no public solicitation has come out. So right now there's a lot of freedom. The contracting community, the program community has a lot of freedom to talk to you. And in fact, that's part of the phase 0 is before you go to all the trouble and maybe easily 100 hours of time to build your proposal, you should definitely send in a 2-page overview of your concept and send it in and see sort of, hey, what do you think?
And you're sending that into an agency, right? Because it's not, this isn't the SBA. This isn't just a pot of money the SBA has. It's contributed by, I think, 11 different agencies, and they're the ultimate customer / funder, right?
That's right. So SBA is just basically all that the SBA does here is set overarching policy that affects all agencies and advertise on behalf of the program. All the topics and award decisions and dollar amounts and dates and all the operational elements of the program are handled at the agency level.
Gotcha. Are there other phase 0 things? I mean, it seems like we have some folks out there that might be sitting on ideas. What do they need to be thinking about right now?
So the number one thing I would say you need to be thinking about as a phase 0 company is how do you figure out where there's a need that you can plug into? Because all of this is needs driven. I mean, you may have a delightful idea about, whatever, super tough thread. But if none of the agencies release a topic around durable clothing or, stronger ropes or, some other need set where your solution would be a solution, well, you're out of luck. There are some caveats to that. The new Air Force program has a much, much broader aperture for what they're willing to look at in any given cycle. The National Science Foundation's SBIR program is much, much broader when it comes to the topics that they basically, the NSF, as close as possible, says, send us good ideas, and if we like it, we'll fund you. Like, they are super broad in how they scope their needs at each cycle. But for everybody else, the first thing you need to figure out is is there going to be a topic that aligns to something that I do? Which creates a real dilemma for a small business owner, because, how do you know what's going to come out 2 months from now? So like, you may say, hey, whatever, Department of the Navy has funded Internet of Things endpoint security solutions twice in the past year. Well, that's cool, but that's no guarantee that they'll fund that same basic topic 3 months from now when their next release is. So this is one of those times where, so I would say that the thing I would be really cautious about with SBIR is because of that, I think it's really hard to go from a standstill all the way to starting an SBIR company based on an SBIR opportunity. I think that that's just because it's basically because of that lack of predictability is a huge hindrance to the program as a true seed fund. I think that's my number one issue with how the SBIR program characterizes itself, because like, yeah, on the one hand, it is providing seed capital. On the other hand, a seed investor is open to any good idea. A seed investor may have a portfolio or a technological domain where they focus. Nobody can know everything about everything. But it's like, okay, I'm a seed investor. I tend to invest in cybersecurity solutions. So any day of the week, anything that falls kind of underneath that domain, if I like your pitch, I can invest in you. Whereas with the SBIR program, everything kind of cues off of that need being released.
Gotcha.
So where
it's not like a product market fit thing. It's not just like, oh, I've got a product, there's a market for it, let's get some SBIR funding. It's a little bit more deliberate front end, like match it or find something that matches. If there's an opportunity there, I'll pursue. Yeah.
So yes. And I think there are some ways to make that really that nasty dilemma work for you. So number one way is I think that this is a great program for graduate students. Like if you're a PhD student or in a master's program, well, you've got 2 to 6 years available where you're studying a particular area. And if you hopefully over those, especially if you're in a STEM field, you should be getting smart on a particular topic, and then you've got the flexibility, you've got the time, 2 to 6 years to be mercenary. You're doing something, you're a biochemist and you're doing a master's in that, and you're really interested in some kind of polymer. Next thing you know, you're keeping half an eye on the SBIR program, and HHS puts something out that broadly aligns to that topic. Well, you've got, if you're in a 2-year program, and most of the agencies put requirements out 2 to 3 times a year, so you potentially can you can see 4 to 6 SBIR cycles come through, and if one of the topics in one of those cycles is a good match, well, now you jump on it, you take a leave of absence for school from a semester to do your phase 1. And then you come back while you're waiting for your phase 2 to have a decision made on it, and everybody's happy. Like that's a great way to approach it. I also I think that SBIR is great for a company that's a going concern. That like this was the situation we were in. We were building HR and data analytics products for our traditional customers. We saw this opportunity come along under the SBIR program, and we said, gosh, if we massaged what we're already doing a little bit, we could probably meet this requirement. That's what we proposed. We won, and that was awesome. But if I had been at a complete unmoving, if I had been standing still when those data analytics or HR analytics topics came out, there was no way that I could have built the foundation and the credibility and have built all the necessary items to have made a compelling proposal.
That's interesting. I think, and also really important for folks to understand is, I guess there's a degree of kismet. Maybe you're working on something and then you've got some traction on it, but maybe it's just not an opportunity that you see a lot of investment activity around. But then, hey, you notice SBIR or there's a topic that comes out and it's closely related to what you're doing, you could be like a small pivot away from phase one.
That's right.
And then, so I think Peter's got a good question that's sort of on topic right now. Like, who are the agents? Who are the customers? Like, who are you writing to? Is it the topic author or is it, somebody else?
Yeah, good question. So the way, so just maybe, probably makes sense to spend 2 minutes on the structure of the program. So Brian, as far as I'm aware, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, I know more about the DoD SBIR world than the civilian agencies, but I think the civilian agencies broadly work along the same lines. So each of these agencies have hundreds of millions of dollars of R&D budget, but there's a quote unquote 3% tax put on that. Well, it's just shy of 3%, but whatever. There's a small tax put on those funds, and those funds are what become the SBIR budget. So, if you reverse the math, that means that the overall federal R&D budget is about $100 billion. It's about a 3% tax on that fund, on that money, then that $3 billion becomes SBIR. Great. And that's on a by-agency level. Then the way that the topics come up is it's a variety of different ways. So the one way is that, so by and large, the SBIR budgets are administered by the same people that administer the larger grants budget. So, the administrator of the lab, the internal lab, like for example, at Air Force Research Lab, administers the Air Force's SBIR budget. So Dr. Roper is over there, and his people who are working different portfolios are identifying areas that they would like new research into. I.e., we need new research into jets and new research into secure networks and on and on and on and on. Great. And they're making decisions. They're saying, gosh, is this the sort of thing we want to do in-house with our own employees? Is this the sort of thing where we want to write a grant to a university or a MITRE or a Battelle and have them do it? Or is this like a really, a bite-sized, relatively small piece of research that may be a good fit for SBIR? So option number one is that the labs people, the administrators of the greater R&D portfolios are identifying topics and scoping them to be SBIRs. Way number two that you get a topic is that somebody from that agency floats it up. It's the sort of thing, it could be a pilot, it could be a crew chief in the back of a helicopter, it could be, somebody working at a lab in one of the NIH's, labs, and that one of those people says, gosh, I really wish I had a solution for blank. I've got, especially in the military side, you see this a lot, like a topic came out relatively recently for shelf-stable blood that would be usable for transfusions out in the hot environments of Iraq and Afghanistan. And as I understand it, that was a medic who was, an operational medic working overseas, said, hey, this is something I need. And they passed it on to their leadership, and the leadership passed it on to Army Research Lab, and Army Research Lab said, yeah, this is something that we need. Great, that's gonna be a topic. So it can be, so they can either come from the labs and the program officers themselves, they can come from, quote unquote, frontline active doers within the agency. And then the third way is that you can submit a topic. And generally these take the form of white papers. You can say, hey, I think that there's a issue that the Air Force or NIH or EPA is facing along these lines. And you're not exactly pitching your solution, but you are pitching the problem that your solution is uniquely well suited to address. And that third, so that third way is obviously the one that you have the most agency and control over, which is great. The bad side of that approach is that it takes forever.
I'd sort of liken that, though, I guess, like an unsolicited proposal type.
Yeah, and technically that's what you're doing.
Right. Now, is the government then going to turn that around into a solicitation and go back out to market with it? So that suddenly, my great idea. Yeah, right.
Well, but that's one of the reasons why it's important to scope your proposal in terms that make you uniquely qualified. Like if you, at the end of the day, if you're selling pencils or something else that's also super commoditized, then don't write these sorts of proposals, because every other pencil manufacturer is just as well positioned as you to write a response. Whereas if you come in there and say, you have some real niche bespoke technology that meets a niche bespoke problem that the government also has, well, fair enough, other people could propose their own solutions. And in fact, they can, they probably will, but you've hopefully got a huge head start on them.
Right. I think there's a saying that if you're not cannibalizing your own idea, then somebody else is, right? Or if somebody else can, then you probably shouldn't be taking it to market. Interesting. So, all right. So we've kind of learned that there is a degree of call and response. So you want to make sure that the government's already sort of looking for what you intend to position for an SBIR grant, unless you want to take the unsolicited proposal route. But let's just say you're interested in seeing what's out there right now. You can go to SBIR.gov, like a solicitation listing, and then open the URLs right there in the PowerPoint here. How often do these things come out? Because I pulled this today, and it looks like there's only 2 open opportunities. Is there like a season for SBIR announcements, or do they just kind of come out?
Not really. I mean, the DoD is on a 4-month cycle, so they have 3 solicitations a year. What was it? I think it was end of May or early June. And then whatever that would be. And I think it's like October is the next one. And then maybe January is the next one. So that's DoD. And then every agency is on their own. Some people only do 1 solicitation a year, like Department of Education, tiny agency, tiny R&D budget. So I think, they only have like 2 topics every year. Okay, cool. Department of Defense, huge agency, huge R&D budget, thousands of topics every year. But if you want, but basically what it comes down to is you have to be going back to SBIR.gov somewhat regularly to see what's out there.
Gotcha. Are there matchmakers out there? Are there people that are just looking at SBIRs and they have a network of startups and they're like, all right, let's do this. Let's match it up.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've got SBIR Mills whose entire business model is around applying for and winning phase 1 and phase 2s. You've got matchmakers out there who are basically doing what you've just said. These tend to be the big BD teams. It's like the outsourced BD, government BD shops that are doing the same thing. They're reading FBO each morning to try to identify all the opportunities that their customers could take advantage of, and then they're also feeding them out the SBIR topics that are good matches.
Yeah, very interesting. I have I think is an important question that hopefully you can shed some light on as we sort of wind down. But so I take an SBIR grant. I do my phase 1 and phase 2, and I've got a very viable product that's now poised for commercial success that the government has effectively invested in and given me the money to build. Do they own it or do I?
Yeah, good question. So the way that government IP rights are written is baffling. It's super counterintuitive, and you can negotiate them, by the way. So as part of your application, you should be scoping the IP rights. Now, as a rule of thumb, the government is always going to want to have a license to produce or to use and to effectively produce that product. Now, I can tell you right now, government doesn't produce anything. Like, they produce nothing. So the chances that they're going to spool up a factory or a bunch of developers to go build what you've built, or that they're going to repurpose and spread your software platform across the agency is just about zero. Now, there are some restrictions. There could be some restrictions on commercial sales if the product that you developed have obvious military applications. If you're getting funded to build the next generation of stealth technology, they don't want you selling that to Iran.
Right.
That's a really small group of topics. So pretty unlikely that's going to affect anybody out there. As a rule of thumb, the short answer is that the government wants you to sell your product commercially. Number one, because that's part of the mission of SBIR is to seed economic activity, and economic activity doesn't happen if you can't sell. So number one, They want you to sell your commercial product just as a philosophical matter. And then as a pragmatic, practical matter, they want you to sell to commercial customers because as you achieve scale, that should bring down their price.
Right. Is it fair to say, I mean, because I know IP rights and data, those types of things are probably going to be top of mind for an entrepreneur, especially if they're building something like this. I mean, is it kind of fair to say that that's a bit of a straw man, given what you just said?
Yeah, I know I have a lot of friends who are humorless and militant about their IP. And after, it's one of these things where I understand the IP regime a little bit, but I know they understand the IP regime 100% and they've still participated. So that's pretty, if it's sort of like, if they're okay with the IP protocols, then I am too.
Gotcha. If you really want to get into the weeds on the IP question, I would definitely, do your diligence, obviously. Read the policy directive. It's a beast of a document, but it'll really get in there. And it's good because everything from the regulatory authority to, your rights and data to government's, I think it's like 20-year license to use your thing or whatever it is. But then, it does, like you mentioned, you can negotiate all of these things. So that's a really important resource. Eligibility requirements. Jeff, do you want to talk that a little bit? Because I know, like you mentioned earlier, has changed a little bit or loosened with regard to its eligibility for VC-backed concerns. Who's eligible for it?
I think the short rule of thumb is if you're on this call, you're eligible. And even if you're not eligible, there are a million ways to work around. Like the eligibility requirements are so, they're non-onerous. I wouldn't worry about it.
Cool. What's your favorite success story so far? Either one that you've been personally involved in or one that you just observed?
Gosh, for a while we used to keep a list of funny like SBIR topics on our website just because we thought it was entertaining. And there were some of them are really kind of from the sublime to the ridiculous. I've seen things about the decibel level at cocktail parties and the implications for hearing loss and being able to hear speech in them. There have been some really kind of bizarre ones around sensors to detect really bespoke items. I actually really like the SBIR that we just won is super meta. We won an SBIR to create tools to help other people apply for SBIR. So that's it's sort of in the world of the, it's only this program would have such a thing. But, obviously selfishly and as a taxpayer, I actually think it is a very good idea for them to do that, to have done that.
Now, was that something that just came out on the open market? Was that a solicitation, or was that you going and saying, "Hey, you guys really need this"? Because nobody understands.
It actually came out. It was came out as a topic, and we've been building SBIR how-to videos and posting them on YouTube for a few years now. Kind of not quite since our first loss, but pretty soon thereafter, we started building kind of how-to videos based on what we had learned by going through the experience. And then we started building more videos once we started winning some, just about our experience. And so, if anybody's listening, on the Eastern Foundry website, upper right-hand corner, we have a bunch of free videos that talk about our experience and thoughts and reflections on the SBIR program.
We've got it linked as well on this critical resources slide. How to win SBIR should have an I there. SBIR grants. What's one thing you learned from one of your losses that you could pass on to our audience?
From one of the losses, yeah, exactly. I think that the biggest things that I learned were that they get so many solicitations each year and they're so concerned about awarding money into kind of fraudulent, I won't say fraudulent, but into topics that lack merit, that developing trust and a deep understanding of the customer is really important. like I think that one of the things that where we really missed the boat on our first application is that we understood the customer's need in sort of in the general sort of way that, you know, sort of the cocktail party level of understanding of the customer's problem. And you know, and as a result, what the solution that we scoped was actually quite was way too broad. And you know, it might have been able to work, but it was really we were trying to cover going to try to cover a mile of coverage, when in the reality the government wanted just this one hole patched up.
Interesting.
And so I think that one thing that one sort of overarching observation is that anybody who's going after SBIR should treat this like they would treat starting any business, because because basically one of a couple things: either you are starting a new business, you know, you're taking your PhD work and trying to start a business out of it, in which case you need to build a full business plan, or you're a commercially oriented company that is entering the government market for the first time with a new funding mechanism to catapult you into it, in which case you should just treat entering the government market and operating the government market and building a product for the government market as a new business. You know, go through the same rigorous planning and customer evaluation and engagement analysis that you would any other. And then even if you are an established government player, you know, with good understandings and good connections, the SBIR program and operating against an SBIR R&D type project is different from a traditional service delivery or, you know, product resale type environment. So one piece of advice, I wish I had taken this on our first one, was build out a full business model for this part of your business and do the full customer discovery that you would for a commercially oriented product. Just understanding that the government and the, you know, particular people within the government are your customer. So don't under-index on the business side of small business innovation research.
Interesting. I've heard these are highly competitive. Would you recommend people give it a shot? I mean, is it a lot of effort to put a proposal together? What do you think about that?
Well, I think it depends on which program you're going after and where you are. So, you know, under the new Air Force dual use SBIR, you know, if you have a product that's, you know, fully functional and, you know, just needs a little bit of evolution to meet the peculiarities of the Air Force need, you could probably have a proposal out in, I don't know, choose a number, 20 to 60 hours would probably be a good range. And so, you know, 20 to 60 hours to get on phase one, $50,000 of initial funding, and then up to $750,000 of phase two funding. Gosh, that's a pretty good return on your hourly rate.
Okay.
So, and that's number one. Then number two, the process you go through, if you treat the SBIR proposal seriously and you do your customer research and you build your business model and you really get good at articulating the problems that you solve and the benefits and functions and features of your solution, well, that's not time lost. Like all of that insight and research and articulation is going to go flow into some other pitch deck you do, whether that's for a traditional investor or to a prospective customer, or it'll inform how you think about your business, or it'll inform how you think about your product development plan. So I think that all of this is time well spent. And then the question becomes, so given that you need to spend this time to do your homework, to do your planning at some point or another, I would argue that the incremental cost in time is very, very small. You know, the hard part about writing the SBIR application is getting your thinking clear and really doing and building the plan. And then once you've got really good clarity and customer understanding and market understanding and all the other stuff you need to do anyway, the actual time that it takes you to take that and put it into the Air Force or agency format is relatively small.
So it's good business exercise no matter what.
good business exercise no matter what. Now, I will say that for other SBIRs, you know, the especially I'm trying to think of, you know, basically the traditional Air Force or other DoD, that observation breaks down a little bit because that application requires you to put a lot of time into like a statement of work over with the exact objectives that you would be doing under the SBIR timeline and framework, and you're having to address a lot of compliance issues. And just, I think that there's a lot of stuff that you put into those bigger proposals that don't have as much obvious commercial application or your business exercise application. You know, it's not terrible, and it probably would, you know, it does help you incrementally, but is it worth the time invested? Maybe not. So just so. And then as far as the actual win rates, you know, I think that, I don't know if that was sort of implied in the question. I think, gosh, I think that the official numbers, and I can't remember where I saw this, but I think that kind of, you know, it's different by agency and by year, but on the traditional SBIRs, kind of across agencies, for phase one, a 15% win rate, I think, is average. And then on phase twos, I think it's about a 50% win rate is about average.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, it's like that 15% win rate can sound really low from the outset, you know, sort of a 1 in 7 chance of winning. But, you know, keep in mind, if you try to go get investor funding, yeah, I'm trying to remember where I read this. I think it was to get a $500,000 investment, it took 100 pitches.
Wow.
I think I was listening to some like, you know, some sort of panel discussion about what it takes to get investor funding. I think that was the ratio. It was 100 pitch meetings for $500,000 to eventually get $500,000 in investment. So 100 pitches, you know, you're talking all the time to prep and to travel and to do the pitch. You know, you're talking about hundreds of hours of invested time. So I actually think the SBIR has got a really good return on invested time.
Fantastic. Well, speaking of time, we're about out of our time. It's kind of slipped away from me because this conversation has been so fluid. Any parting thoughts or words of wisdom, or, you know, what you would recommend to people who want to get started, especially if they want to leverage what Eastern Foundry has put together?
Yeah, I mean, the other day we've just kind of taken the position that we want to see more people get involved, and so we've been publishing a lot of free videos and classes on the different, you know, kind of all the things that we've talked about here and a lot more, you know, a lot more depth. You know, how do we think about SBIR as opposed to VC? How do we think about the technical risk sections, technical merit sections, and business cases, and all of the other pieces? So, you know, it's obviously it's our own product, but we, you know, also we don't sell it. It's just there for anybody who's interested. That would be my first recommendation of resources.
Right on. And again, that's linked right here in this deck that we're going to be sending out tomorrow, along with a recording of our webinar today. So Jeff, again, really appreciate your time and your insight here. I mean, I've learned a ton just in our conversation. So, you know, if there's any other questions from the audience, it looks like we're sort of tailing off and losing folks. So we can go ahead and kind of end it here. But maybe we ought to do, you know, another one of these down the road, Jeff, and thank you again for joining us.
Excellent. My pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Jeff and Eastern Foundry. Thanks, Ivalua, for sponsoring this webinar. And we'll see y'all on the next one, okay? Bye-bye now.
Bye.